Is it correct that you were thinking about writing an Ange Postecoglou biography?
Not quite, no, not an Ange Postecoglou biography, but I have mostly written a long article about Ange Postecoglou that I hope to publish somewhere over the coming year. And it's really an argument about Australia and about a different form of Australian leadership and Australian national character, rather than an article about football. So I think he represents something new and interesting about Australia, and something maybe a bit more ambitious that we've lacked in the past.
What is that you're looking for? A different type of leadership, that more ambition?
Yeah, so it's really a question of ambition, and the fact that throughout his career he has always pushed aside demands for pragmatism. So pragmatism is a very Australian quality, and in many respects is very laudable and important and useful quality, and it's been great in the gradual building of the Australian nation, if you like. It's a really Australian quality that filters through. I mean, it's there in the Anzacs, it's there in Gallipoli, and it comes through in our politics and so many aspects of Australian life, the kind of, tie it up with wire kind of approach, rather than a high-minded, elevated, utopian approach. Right. Ange is not like that. He's always said, no, pragmatism is for others. I'm a dreamer. I want to do big things. So when he quit the Australia job, for instance, he said he'd already had huge success. The Socceroos had won the Asian Cup. They qualified for the World Cup. And yet Ange said he wanted to transform the country into a footballing powerhouse in Asia. Not just win tournaments, but actually change the character of the nation so that it became a footballing powerhouse. And the fact that he failed to do that was one of the reasons that he quit. And so what I see in him is a kind of an idealistic quality that you rarely see in Australia. Someone who not only wants to make the best of the circumstances and cope really well with adversity, which is really what pragmatism is, but someone who wants to actually transform the status quo, who wants to shape entire institutions in order to build something big, and that's built on imagination. And that's something that he has that I don't see a lot of in Australian leadership.
It's funny, this kind of naturally also segues into the Echidna Strategy, because I think one of the observations, whether it's a complaint or not, that you make about historically our reliance on allies is that, no, we can actually take care of this ourselves. We don't need to necessarily rely on the wires just holding everything together. We can shoot for exceptionalism, dream real big.
Well, it's probably not an accident that those two things are linked, right? Those are qualities I admire, and I think those are qualities that I think Australia could do with more of. So, yes, I think that there is a tendency to underestimate exactly what Australia has achieved. I mean, by any reasonable analysis, I mean, look around you. This country's a miracle. It's built on almost nothing to create one of the most advanced nations on earth, one of the freest nations on earth. It's a huge achievement, therefore, it seems to me weird to believe that it is beyond us to also defend ourselves. And when I look at the facts of the situation, even in an environment where we're facing a huge challenge from a rising China, it seems to me completely within our capabilities to do this ourselves. The tough news is that not only can we choose to do this ourselves, but actually we're going to be forced to do it ourselves. Right? This is an argument we'll get into about America's place in the region, but it's actually consistent with historical trends in Australia that oftentimes we've been forced into independence. We've been forced to do more for ourselves against our will, and we've protested sometimes pretty harshly and violently when we've been forced towards independence. We didn't love it when the Brits joined the European community. We didn't love it 2 or 3 decades earlier when they lost Singapore, right? We didn't like it when the Americans under Nixon announced the Guam Doctrine. But we coped pretty well. All things considered, Australia coped pretty well. And we're now in an era where not only is China bigger, but America's a receding power in our region, I think slowly declining power. And so, again, we're being forced to be free, in a sense. And we'll protest, and we won't like it very much. But in the end, I'm pretty confident, actually, that we'll do it fairly well.
Did you ever read Jared Diamond's book, Upheaval?
No, I'm not familiar.
It's 13 different chapters, and it's 13 different case studies of countries that faced this future-defining fork in the road. Australia is one of the chapters, and it's about after we'd lost Singapore, and the Brits had sort of really turned their backs on us, and then we looked at Britain and said, well, actually, you're not really good partners anymore. And then that's the big shift to America.
Right.
Is it too much to say that we're having a similar type of degrading relationship with whatever this US historical ally might have been towards now the future of independence?
Well, I think in substance, the similarities are very strong because the Americans are going to recede as an Asian power, just as Britain did after the fall of Singapore. It's different in the sense that we're not witnessing a physical withdrawal in the way that the UK withdrew after Singapore, and then that was consecrated in the East of Suez doctrine after the Second World War. We've not seen anything like that, and I don't think it's likely that the Americans will actually physically withdraw, even under Trump, even though Trump, in my view, is that Trump himself has that inclination. I doubt that'll happen in this term. So it's a slightly more subtle and more nuanced phenomenon than the physical withdrawal imposed by military defeat. That's not what's happening. What's happening and what I describe in the Echidna Strategy is essentially a loss of will, a loss of resolve from the Americans. You don't see it reflected so much in troops being pulled back because there's no strong bureaucratic incentive at the moment for the Americans to pull back. It doesn't cost them very much to be here. Yeah, it's a more subtle phenomenon, but nevertheless, it has the same overall implications for us. At its core, what it means is that even if all the accoutrements of an alliance are still there, we have exercises. We now are starting to talk about American military facilities on Australian soil. We have AUKUS. We have joint training. We have the Five Eyes intelligence relationship. It's all there. But at the core of an alliance, of any military alliance that's worth the name, is this sense that the two sides will be prepared to come to each other's defence in an emergency. And that's the bit that's eroding.
Right. Is that erosion bigger than Trump?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, it's already 30 years old, I would argue. Okay. And the reason I picked, 30 odd years, it's over 30 years now. The reason I picked that number is because the end of the Cold War happens in 1989 to 1991. And that's also the time when, roughly when you can date the beginning of China's military modernization. So in 1991, in 1990, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. In 1991, the Americans push him out. And the Chinese, while observing that operation, get the shock of their lives. They say, this was such an overwhelming and incredible feat of military art that the Chinese look at themselves and say, well, compared to that, we are moribund. We are still operating a 1950s style military force that would get completely overrun by the Americans. And so most experts date the beginning of China's military modernization to that period, to 1991. So what's happened in that 30 odd years since? Well, we've seen the most dramatic military modernization of any country since the Second World War. China has taken this challenge extremely seriously, and it's doing incredibly well, right? And still at a relatively modest level of military spending, probably around 2% of GDP, right? So they're not even breaking a sweat, and they have done incredibly well to modernise their military to the level that they have. And at the same time, what have the Americans done? Almost nothing, right? So the force structure that was in place in Asia in 1991 at the end of the Cold War, compared to the one they have in place in Asia today, it's almost the same. Of course, the weapons are more modern, but the numbers are roughly the same. Same number of ships, troops, fighter aircraft wings, etc. Small uptick in the number of submarines, but that and there's been in recent years a wider distribution of military facilities that can host US forces, but they're not growing those forces.
The gap between the two lines over time is only increasing.
Look, you could argue that the gap still favours the United States. So we haven't crossed, the two lines haven't crossed yet. So in pure military power terms.
So they're decreasing
towards
the convex.
Yeah, that's right. But eventually they're going to cross and then the Chinese will go ahead. But look, even at the moment, whilst China has arguably less overall military power than the United States, that's just numbers on a spreadsheet. When it comes to a fight in Asia, we're already at the point where even if China can't overwhelmingly win against America, it can certainly impose high enough costs on the Americans that it's not worth it.
Right. That opportunity cost trade-off is all throughout the book, and also something I learned from the book, and you just mentioned it, the observation of what percentage of GDP is military spending as a way to measure between different countries, how much are they spending. Obviously, as an analyst, that's probably day one, you sort of learn that measurement, but
Sure.
I think for a lay person, you don't really think about it that way. If China's spending 2% of their budget and they're doing and they're producing at such higher efficiency, is that an observation of the benefit from having that one-party state that is in power for decades and decades and decades, that consistency over time?
They're producing at higher efficiency, but also they have much lower labour costs than Western powers do. So that makes a huge difference to the human resources that you put in place to
the capital
a shipyard,
expenditure
for
to get it
instance.
done.
Yeah. Now, of course, that advantage is going to erode over time as China gets richer.
We're actually already seeing that. There's an incredible book out now by Pat McGee. It's called The China Problem. Oh, you're going to love it. It's an analysis of Apple in China over the last 2 decades. And it makes this, it's so compelling, I couldn't imagine arguing against it, that the majority of China's technical superiority, which they have now, especially in the region, but potentially internationally as well, is because of Apple's investment into them, almost single-handedly.
Well, I think it is in the sense that there's now strong indications that Apple's moving into India more because production costs are going to be lower there than in China.
He even makes, you really, I think you'll get a kick out of it. It's an incredible book.
So to continue the point, I mean, so that advantage in production costs is going to erode over time, and you have to pay soldiers and airmen and sailors more over time because China's going to become a wealthier nation. So, but even all that aside, it's clear that at a broad macro level, China is a production manufacturing powerhouse, and it finds it much easier to build weapons at large scale than the Americans now do. Shipbuilding is a particular area of vulnerability for the Americans. It's always been a weakness historically because it's been heavily protected. So to answer your question, I think it's got less to do with China being a one-party state.
With the political structure rather just the economics of the country.
Yeah, and the political economy, essentially. I think in this case, China has superior political economic settings than the United States does.
The broad reputation that Chinese stuff is of lower quality is slowly eroding over time, but can the same broad observation be made to the quality of the military equipment that they're producing versus Swedish stuff or your American stuff?
Yeah, well, I'm shopping for a new car at the moment, so I can speak to that question directly about the quality of Chinese goods. That has eroded and has, I would argue, disappeared entirely, at least as far as EVs are concerned.
You're not going to get a BYD, are you?
Haven't decided
Does
yet.
that hurt ethically a little bit?
That's a big question. I noticed actually last year there was a senior government minister, I can't remember which one, who admitted in a Senate estimates hearing that he owned a BYD, and he had to have some of the security settings changed on the car in order to conform with his department's guidance. So
you have that intelligence consideration to take into account as well, don't you? Yeah.
But mind you, so all car companies do this now, right? They all have cameras and everything's recorded and taken back to headquarters. I presume in order to build out the kind of autonomous driving infrastructure for the future.
Undoubtedly, it has applications towards that.
Yeah.
But it could also.
Yeah, but I ask myself, well, what are these cars seeing that they're not supposed to see, right? I mean, they're all open roads. If cars are heading into, for instance, secure facilities, they're still being parked in a car park outside. I'm not quite sure exactly what the security dilemma is there.
As an intelligence analyst, former intelligence analyst, isn't there value to knowing what is Sam Roggeveen's daily commute?
Yeah.
Why did he stay at this house for an hour, 3 times a week for 4 years in a row?
Yeah.
Maybe there's someone like...
I see that point.
Or is that just a overestimation getting into, thinking about... Because another point you make is just actually a lot of this sort of more secret intelligence isn't as valuable. Could it just be that same problem?
Yes, so I would concede that point, actually. I mean, particularly for high value individuals, there is something to be learned from those kind of boring everyday facts about where people spend their time. So yeah, I can understand that point. I mean, the broader point that you raise about intelligence is just is one that it's a question really of. In a radically open source world where there is so much data around, does it make a lot of sense to devote resources to unearthing even more information? Or should we be spending more time and money trying to exploit the sources that we have openly? That's a much bigger question, and it's not one that intelligence agencies, I would argue, even in China, are making. They are they have bureaucratic incentives to say, no, we need to be spying on these people. So that will continue so long as spying agencies have enough diplomatic sway to keep it going.
Without revealing anything confidential, obviously you won't. But what do we understand about the bot farms, and to the extent that they are effectively infiltrating people's idea of a certain event, a certain politician, a certain global situation? Because I'm just imagining in the endless ocean of all this open source information, some might estimate it's 20-30% of it is bot fueled. Maybe not created, but fueled. And do our intelligence agencies actually have a handle on determining where does it come from, how do we stop it, etc.? This is outside the remit of the Echidna Strategy, but it just popped into mind. And
yeah. And unfortunately, I can't speak to it with any degree of knowledge at all. I guess the only thing I'd say is that, to reinforce the previous answer, my sense is that our intelligence agencies have maintained their traditional focus on gathering secrets in
clandestine.
In a clandestine manner. In other words, stealing information from sources that are disinclined to give it away. And then what they do is they bring all that information together, and the analysts who sit here in Canberra in various offices, their job is to be what they call all source analysts, to bring all that stuff together and tell politicians, tell our leaders what they think it means and what the implications are for Australia. What I don't see a lot of evidence of from the intelligence community is a cultural shift towards exploiting open sources and marginalising classified sources. And to my mind, that is overdue.
Mm-hmm. All right, shifting more to the Echidna Strategy. Are you familiar with Tim Marshall's work, the Prison Geography series?
No.
Enormous bestseller about 13, 14 years ago. He followed it up with 2 other books, but it's basically just applying a geographical explanation for the modern culture, economy, geopolitics of a certain nation, right? So it's just geography first. I wanted to ask you if you could apply the Tim Marshall lens to Australia, which you do in the book, but just the geographical limitations of Australia, offense, defense, threats, etc.
Yeah, so there's a quite a stark statement, and I'm not going to be able to quote it verbatim because I've forgotten it, although I've read it and even transcribed it many times. It comes in the National Defence Strategy of 2024 to the effect that modern technology has severely eroded Australia's geographic advantage. I fundamentally disagree. That is a drastic overstatement. And so the way to answer your question about geography is to say that the basic physics and engineering of military conflict, of warfare, and of weapons development and weapons manufacturing, physics and engineering still are at the core of that, and the restrictions imposed by those two things have not been overcome. So distance still advantages you enormously. I routinely in interviews and in op-eds will say Beijing is closer to Berlin than it is to Sydney.
Amazing statistic.
And it
So
matters.
counterintuitive.
Yeah, exactly, very counterintuitive. But it matters because throwing high explosives at a target, which is essentially what most weapon systems do, you're putting high explosives onto a target, is much harder. It gets exponentially harder the further away it is. So the example that I use in the book is, let's say you're a military commander and you've got to destroy a target over the next hill, and you've got 500 kilograms of explosive by which to do it. Well, how do you do it if it's over the next hill? You'd probably use mortar fire, or you could even surreptitiously, under cover of night, you could move it in there. I don't know, in a truck or on backpacks of your infantry. Now let's say that particular target is not 500 metres away, it's 5,000 metres away. Well, what do you do then? Okay, then you need artillery. Now, artillery requires not only the guns themselves, which are much more expensive than mortars, or much more expensive than trucks or infantry, but it means you've either got to have the infrastructure behind it to support that artillery system and to build artillery pieces, or you've got to buy it from overseas. Let's take another step forward and say it's not 5,000 metres, it's 500 kilometres. Well, then you need aircraft. And that's an even bigger infrastructure behind it. You need training, you need pilots, you need engineers, you need maintenance, you need runways, protected air bases. You may even decide you want to manufacture these aircraft domestically. You need a whole domestic aerospace sector to do that. Right? So now let's say it's 5,000 kilometres away. Well, then you need an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile. And in order to have an ICBM, you need a space program. You need a totally mature space program that can not only launch things into orbit, but actually, ping targets that are on the other side of the world. So at every step, at every remove from 500 metres to 5,000 kilometres, it gets incredibly more expensive. But one thing stays constant, and that's the amount of high explosive. It's still 500 kilograms of high explosive, whether it's over the next hill or on an ICBM. I mean, it's shocking to people, but an ICBM can carry a few kilos of high explosive, but not much more than that. So, it's an incredibly expensive way of achieving a military effect. So maintaining your distance from people, from an enemy, that's been an objective in military strategy, since people were throwing rocks at each other. Cavemen were throwing rocks at each other. You always want to keep your distance. So that's a massive geographic gift that Australia has been given. And my argument about AUKUS, and we can get into this, is that effectively what we're trying to do is compress the distance between us and our likely adversary, China, when what we should be doing is exploiting it.
Is there anything to the fact that Sydney and Melbourne are even further away? Does that argument fall apart-ish when, for instance, a Chinese vessel could launch from a South Pacific island that's very close to some part of Australia, further underneath the geographical blessing that we have?
Yeah.
Do some of those other factors come into it as well? The fact that most of it's desert and there isn't much there. And if they want to extract the resources, it's like a whole nother level of infrastructure that needs to come over.
Yeah. Well, first of all, if you want to extract Australia's resources, a far cheaper way to do it is to buy them. Yeah. It's much cheaper. And that goes to the broader question of, does Australia have any reasonable reason to fear that we'll ever be invaded? And I think no. The answer is a flat no. It's just so hard. I would argue even the United States can't do it. Australia is so big, and this goes to the other part of your question. Our major population centres in particular are so far away.
Even further, yeah.
Yeah. And let's say you could do it. Let's say you did summon the resources to do it. What possible objective could justify those resources, the use of those resources? So nothing could be important enough to justify invading Australia. So then what else is there? There is what I would call coercive police actions against Australia, attempts to intimidate us by the use of military force. So that could be airstrikes or missile strikes, and this gets into the other part of your question about potentially Chinese military facilities in the Pacific. So that's a real concern. We should take that very, very seriously, because then you do undermine the big advantage, the big geographical advantage that Australia has. Because it's suddenly, if China has a military base in the Pacific, it becomes much, much easier to project large amounts but also persistent levels of force. So if you have to bring a flotilla, so a few months ago, for instance, we had this Chinese flotilla circumnavigating Australia. I mean, that's a big journey. That's a long, long journey. And at that particular flotilla was one frigate and one destroyer. The destroyer might have been carrying maybe 24 cruise missiles that could hit land targets in Australia. So you've come something like 6,000 or 7,000 kilometres, you lob a dozen or 24 cruise missiles into Sydney, and then you go home again. That's another 2-3 weeks to get home, rearm, come down again, right? It's not a lot of military effect. So if you have them stationed nearby, you obviously make it much more efficient to use a large amount of military force against Australia. So that's something Australia desperately wants to avoid, is Chinese military bases in our near abroad.
In your responses now and also all throughout the book, that emphasis on the sheer financial opportunity cost really shines through. And I suppose it's very obvious to someone who's educated in this, but for me, I was surprised, or rather, happy to learn, like, okay, this actually does make sense, that there aren't infinite budgets and infinite resources available to various militaries around the world. And it all comes down to that opportunity cost trade-off. Australia actually just it's not worth it.
Yeah, that is an advantage that all smaller nations have against great powers, is that in a rational decision-making calculus, the great power must always be thinking, will the benefits exceed the costs, right? So in a pure rational calculus world, it doesn't make sense to devote, say, 3/4 or more of your military resources to attacking a state that poses no threat to you, and who, even if you win the war, would have would bring you benefits that in no way exceed that cost. Now, in a way, what I've just described is exactly what Russia has done to Ukraine, right? Devoted about 3/4 of its military to a neighbour. So we've always got to account for the fact that nations don't behave rationally in that way that I've suggested. And it's not just the Russians, by the way. The Americans invaded Iraq, for goodness sake, in 2003, which by any reasonable measure, in no way matched the threat that Iraq posed. I mean, it was totally disproportionate. It made no reasonable sense. And yet they did it anyway. So we've got to account for the fact that great powers are capable of making enormous mistakes. And part of the reason you buy the insurance that you get through military procurement, through maintaining a defence force, is against that kind of irrational action by other countries.
Is the consensus among analysts that China actually has no interest in Australia whatsoever, the way that you could justify Russia having interest in Ukraine or even America having interest in Iraq? Although they're both irrational by many angles, they still happen, so someone thought it was rational. Is the consensus among analysts that Australia truly isn't even on any map of irrationality for China's expansion?
Well, there is certainly consensus that Australia is not a threat of invasion. Yes, that's overwhelming consensus. I think after that it breaks down a lot, and there are major differences among Australian analysts about whether China would ever, direct military force against Australia. And I've been arguing actually that the risks of China using force against Australia are growing because of Australian action, right? So quite apart from the AUKUS submarine deal, which is the major, the headline part of AUKUS, the other aspect of it, potentially more significant, is that we've agreed for the Americans to base their submarines at HMAS Sterling in Western Australia. Separately, we've also decided that we're going to upgrade our airbase at RAAF Tyndall, just south of Darwin, so that American B-52 and B-2 bombers can operate from there. China now has a reason to attack Australia in a way that it didn't before. Now, you could argue that there's a trade-off there, and okay, we get more American help, we get more defence, more deterrence from America, so maybe that's worth it. I would argue that
your
that's
argument
absolutely
is not even
worth
needed in the first place, the American help.
No.
So contrary to that current consensus, you suggest the Echidna strategy. So explain the Echidna metaphor. What does that mean?
Well, the metaphor is essentially designed to evoke an image of a country that is benign and friendly to those who mean it no harm, but spiky and indigestible to those that do. And essentially, it's also meant to evoke an idea that you can defend yourself without having offensive capabilities that can be destabilising and even provocative to another country. So echidnas are no threat to other species unless they're ants or termites. But they're not going to attack. Well, if you think of a natural predator, for instance, like an eagle, like a wedge-tailed eagle, right? No echidna is going to attack an eagle, but the echidna's defence strategy does make it hard for the eagle to attack the echidna, and so that's essentially what I want for Australia. So in a time where we are going to get less help from the United States, and where we've got a great power now that clearly wants to become the leading power in Asia and maybe even the dominant power in Asia, we've got to be able to do it independently and defend ourselves independently. And to my mind, the most affordable and also most stabilising and least provocative way to do that is through an echidna strategy.
Yeah. In the animal kingdom, there aren't any echidnas with territorial ambition for China or Indonesia. The rest of the animal kingdom looks at them and realizes they're not after what I've got.
That's right, yeah. Now, you don't want to overstate that. I don't think anybody believes that Australia has territorial ambitions, although you could argue there is still to this day...
Isn't some in Papua New Guinea?
There is still to this day a faction within the Indonesian military that sees Australia's role in the Timor intervention in a very, the most dark and conspiratorial fashion, believes that Australia engineered a situation in which Timor broke away from Indonesia, and argues furthermore that Australia has similar designs on West Irian. Yeah, so we want to break off another piece of Indonesia. I don't think that's the majority view within Indonesia, and in fact the the bilateral relationship is healthier now than has been in decades. It's very, very strong, but there is still a faction within TNI, the Indonesian military, that believes that. But that's more the exception to the rule. Nobody thinks Australia is an expansionist power. But my point about provocation and destabilisation is more that around AUKUS in particular, but more broadly, most Australian defence analysts argue that Australia, and in fact the Australian government too, argues that Australia ought to have longer range strike power. And what that translates to is the ability to bomb adversaries. And through the AUKUS submarines, through the nuclear-powered submarines, we will gain the capability to sit for weeks, months on end off the coast of China and hem the Chinese Navy in along its coastline and fire cruise missiles onto the Chinese mainland. We will have that capability.
And in your eyes, all of these policy ambitions and projects that are undergoing are tactical mistakes?
Strategic mistakes, in fact, yeah. So mistakes on both what you might call the grand strategic level, the political level, but also at the operational level. So the grand strategic mistake is that we are essentially tying ourselves to American foreign policy ambitions and American strategic ambitions.
Yeah. In the face of a sitting US president who outwardly says he does not care about anyone except America.
Right. So there's that problem, but there's also the opposite problem. So let's assume that the previous faction, the faction that dominated American politics for decades, and particularly after the Cold War, which argued that America needed to be the predominant military power in the world and needed to maintain primacy in Asia. So even in that world, I would argue that AUKUS is a bad idea because it ties us to a hugely ambitious view of American power, right? So in both senses, I think AUKUS is dangerous. And at the operational level, it's dangerous too. I think for the reasons that I just suggested. The best use of this technology is to operate thousands of kilometres from Australian shores, right? To operate off the Chinese coastline, hem the Chinese Navy in along its coastline, and even to fire missiles onto the mainland. That to me is unduly provocative and totally unnecessary for Australia.
Which is not how an echidna would behave. Rather, they would have invested all of that money on just great defensive measures.
Right.
Is your work, since you've been writing about it, since this book's been published, are you noticing that you're influencing policy at the points where decisions are actually made? Well,
the first answer, the obvious answer has to be no, because there's been, I don't think you can see any change in the strong bipartisanship around AUKUS and around the future of the alliance. And by the way, I should stress, I'm pro-alliance. I just think AUKUS is a step too far. I like the alliance we had before AUKUS.
Yeah, you gave a great, in this snippet from the Malcolm Turnbull interview, you gave this fantastic metaphor for a gavel being dropped. If you recall what it is, I thought it described that perfectly.
Well, so the alliance we had before AUKUS was already extremely strong. In fact, the strongest it had been in its history. And so if the alliance was an auction, then the gavel had already come down and the auctioneer had already said sold to Australia. And then AUKUS comes along, which is effectively Australia saying, well, thank you, Mr. Auctioneer, but we'd like to make another bid. Now, that's not usually something you do when you've already won the auction, right? So that's extremely odd behaviour on Australia's part, because part of the motivation for AUKUS was, well, we need to tie the Americans down now. We need to tie them down toward to the region and to us. So, I thought it was not just unnecessary, but actively damaging to Australia's security posture.
However, regarding how you might be actually influencing policy at the decision-making level, I mean, Malcolm Turnbull's clearly in your court, but he's not an active politician.
So a lot of active, a lot of retired leaders. I would argue I'm in the same camp as them. Paul Keating is another one.
It's a very interesting signal.
Yeah.
What do you make of that? That says quite a lot about sitting governments.
Yeah. So, well, the other interesting data point here is that even politicians who... So first of all, it's important to say I'm not the first here to be making... I mean, I've made my own argument in the Echidna Strategy, but obviously we all stand on the shoulders of other analysts, and I owe a lot to Hugh White, for instance, Professor Hugh White from the ANU and his work. And so it's interesting to note that there were a couple of very prominent politicians who also supported Hugh White's viewpoints, notably Malcolm Turnbull, but also Bob Carr. But when they subsequently achieved positions of power, I think Turnbull would argue with this, but I think both of them largely reverted to orthodoxy when it came to the alliance. So it's all very well to argue these points of view when you're outside government, but when you're inside government, the incentive structure starts to change, and it's much harder to maintain a posture of distance from the US alliance. And I don't blame either of them. I mean, look at Mark Latham, for instance, when he was in charge of the Labor Party, and he came out very strongly against the United States and was punished by the electorate. And it's worth noting the alliance is incredibly popular among Australians. I mean, the Lowy Institute, where I work, has been polling for 21 years Australian public opinion on various aspects of foreign policy. Support for the alliance has never been below 63%, and typically it's in the 70s.
Could that just be a case of if it ain't broke, don't fix it? And people see this sort of radically different idea about how we should think about our military as too much change without the eye for the full scope of your argument and the potential future that we are inhabiting?
Well, the advantage of Trump right now is that he changes that dynamic. So I think you're onto something. I think one of the reasons Australians show this kind of support and deference to the US alliance is because they think the alternative is more dangerous. Trump's now making it look like the alternatives are less dangerous. I mean, that's surely what Canadians are asking themselves these days. That would be what many NATO members would be saying to themselves these days, that independence is not so much a risk, it's simply something you have to do because the risks on the other side are getting higher. And again, I stress, I'm not anti-alliance. I think that it offers many, many benefits still. But getting ever closer, particularly through AUKUS, is I think, a sort of historic mistake.
But within the Echidna strategy, there's still room for every type of economic alliance, and then as well maybe emergency alliance. If shit really hits the fan, we may contribute. It's not a full neutrality Swedish type of view.
Well, of course, the Swedish point is outdated now because Sweden's in NATO. They abandoned neutrality to join NATO, which is a really interesting development. So no, absolutely not. I mean, to go back to where I was earlier, the crucial point about the alliance is simply that the assurance we get that the Americans would defend us if we ever needed them to, that part is eroding.
An interesting observation, which you might find intriguing, after Sweden joined NATO, I was living there at the time, and people were overwhelmingly for it, and this happened the idea at least happened within several months of Russia invading Ukraine.
Yeah.
And then within a week or two after they had joined, the consensus flipped again. People started feeling like it was a regret. We rushed into this, our entire, the history we can remember, we've sort of thrived through our neutrality. Perhaps we didn't need to involve ourselves in this one. I don't know what the point is to be made from that observation, but I found it intriguing nonetheless.
I'd be curious to know what the feeling is now, actually. I haven't followed it in Sweden, but I must admit, on the face of it, I was a little surprised by how quickly it all happened. You could argue that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was such a shock. Yeah. But nevertheless, even before the disastrous Russian invasion of Ukraine began, Russia, in military terms, was a shadow of what the Soviet Union was at its peak. And back then, Sweden never decided to join NATO. So why now? I mean, the Russians are materially weaker now, in military terms, less of a threat to Sweden than they were 3 years ago. So on the face of it, you've got to ask yourself, well, you got through the Cold War without joining NATO, so why now? I still question that decision.
I think a big part of it was the feeling of the familial feeling towards the European Union. Yeah. We should really step up and maybe help even more than we already do.
Yes.
I don't know whether that's the case or not. I'm not an analyst, but it's just all anecdotal.
And I think the relationship with the Finns as well had something to do with it, right? It's a very close security relationship.
Yeah, for sure. It's like the narcissism of small differences. They hate each other more than anyone else, but they also recognize they're extremely alike. You make a lot of reference to Philip Tetlock's research, which emphasizes, to put it politely, the inconsistency of expert predictions. And my sense is that a defensive strategy, which is the Echidna strategy, is the most robust to a future of unpredictable events. Because of the way Philip Tetlock's research informed you, did you also feel like that in a world of infinite possibilities, the defensive strategy wins out in most of them?
Yes. But to argue against myself, I'd say the one risk that I'm taking in the strategy that I propose in terms of forecasting about the future is that I rely on a continuation of the present technological trend which advantages the defence over the offence. So what we've witnessed, I'd argue for approaching a half century now, with the mass production and now the the democratization of missile power and also surveillance systems over that period, is what we've witnessed is a slow accretion of advantages towards forces that are defending versus those that are attacking. So it's, in terms of land warfare, for instance, it's much easier to hold territory than to take territory, right? And the Ukraine war illustrates this in every respect. So on land, as I say, much easier to hold territory than to take it, because surveillance is now so pervasive that it's impossible to concentrate military forces in one place, because they'll be attacked within minutes or within hours, right? You can't take territory without first massing your forces, right, and you'll be detected. So you'll just be detected because the battlefield is now totally transparent. In the air, you see the same thing again in the Ukraine war. Both sides now have reverted to lobbing bombs and missiles from within their own airspace, because crossing into enemy airspace is just too dangerous. You'll get shot down.
Wow.
Right? And at sea, it's even more stark. The Ukrainians are winning the naval war and they don't have a navy. Right? They're winning because they have missiles and because they have drones. And they are sinking Russian Black Sea Fleet ships that are, vastly more expensive than anything the Ukrainians can field. But a smaller power can keep a much larger power at bay through missiles and drones. That's an important lesson for Australia. Where I'm going with all of that is on the question of prediction. I'm basically predicting that defensive dominance is going to hold for the indefinite future for Australia. At the moment, I still don't see any prospect that that's going to be undermined. One possibility is that it becomes radically cheaper to shoot down fast-moving missiles. At the moment, it's still incredibly expensive. One of the reasons the Americans have pulled out of the Red Sea, for instance, the Houthis, lobbing missiles at ships, is because it's just too expensive to shoot these missiles down. You can do it, but when the stakes are low, as they are for the Americans against the Houthis, huge opportunity cost. So they don't do it. Now, if the costs of shooting down missiles becomes radically cheaper, then all of a sudden it starts to become much more viable to project force with ships and with aircraft. But nothing like that is on the horizon.
Apart from Ukraine and the Houthis as anecdotes for how defense is significantly cheaper than offense, are there other technological innovations that you're seeing that further this point? I'm leaning towards things like Anduril or Palantir.
Well, I mean, those are the major conflicts going on at the moment. The historical example, really, where I would, you could date this from as early as the 1960s. I think that was the first time. I think it was an Israeli Navy ship that was sunk by an Egyptian, a fairly crude Egyptian anti-ship missile. But the biggest example is the Falklands War historically, where but for a handful of Exocet cruise missiles, the Argentinians would have won that campaign. It was a very close run thing. The Argentinians, I think, only had 5 Exocet missiles. 2 of them found their targets. If they'd had 5 more and potentially sunk an aircraft carrier, then that campaign would have gone, completely in the other direction.
Anduril and Palantir?
Yeah, look, I mean, I guess the only thing I'd say is that they look to be very much in favour in this administration because they are attempting to do to the defence sector and the so-called primes, which are the big defence manufacturers in the United States, attempting to do to them what SpaceX has tried to do in the satellite launch business, is to make it radically cheaper to produce weapons. So time will tell whether they're able to do that. There are a lot of big promises being made. I would just point out that there's a reason that you still see China producing a lot of traditional, large and highly expensive military platforms, is because they do get you capabilities that cheaper drones, for instance, cannot do for you. So the Chinese continue to build big ships, build aircraft carriers. and now building 6th generation fighter aircraft. Really impressive new kit.
Yeah, they sound incredible.
Yeah. So I don't put myself in that school which argues that we're in the midst of the entire sort of defence industrial complex being overturned. That the
By some
premises of
startups.
that's right. So there's certainly a huge place for them, and the Ukraine war clearly demonstrates that. But the Ukrainians still need artillery. The Ukrainians still need F-16s. And they'd probably like having a few small diesel submarines if they could as well.
What are the commercial opportunities going to be in the defence sector for Australia if the Echidna strategy were adopted?
Traditionally, Australia's been pretty reluctant to rely on its own defence sector. So we've had some innovation in the past, but the Australian Defence Force has been somewhat reluctant to buy Australian kit. So there's a cultural problem to be overcome. And again, Ukraine offers a pretty good example of how this can be done. I mean, there are under fire. There is now a massive, by Ukrainian standards, domestic military-industrial complex being created, an innovation complex, and that shows that's showing terrific early success, and overall reliance on Western donated weapons, I think, is decreasing, and much more domestically produced kit. And none of it's particularly sexy or high end. Some of it is crude, cheap and cheerful, but by golly, it's working.
Yeah, like attaching a grenade to a DJI drone, stuff like that.
Right.
But if we are going to just take care of our own defence, wouldn't we have to then be producing and purchasing from Australian suppliers?
No, I don't think so. I don't. Just as I said earlier that I'm not anti-alliance, nor am I in favour of Australia becoming totally self-reliant in its military industries. No country can do that, with the exception perhaps of China and the United States. Even the Americans buy some weapons overseas. And it's not, to me, it's not a rational policy aim anyway. So, for instance, Australia is now busy building a factory that can produce precision-guided munitions. Right? Not our own designs; they'll be American, but we will bolt them together. We will produce them here in Australia. Right? But the microprocessors still come from overseas; they still need to be imported. The guidance equipment still needs to be imported.
The whole supply chain won't be made in Australia,
exactly.
But the final product will be an Australian product. But you're saying potentially it's not even necessary.
Well, look, to me, in purely military terms, all that matters is that you have enough weapons to hand when you need them. It doesn't matter where they're built or where they're made. So the whole reason, the whole argument for bringing everything on shore is that, well, you can't rely on foreign suppliers in wartime. Now, I think there are plenty of holes in that argument, and we can get into that. But let's assume that argument's true, that supplies will be compromised during wartime. Well, that's an argument for having the weapons to hand now. That's an argument for stockpiling. It's not an argument for having defence industries of your own to build these weapons. You just need to have enough of them to hand for when you need them. So I'm all in favour of stockpiling. Economically, it doesn't make a lot of sense to build them ourselves.
And it requires a radical shift in the way that we're thinking about military spending and defence at the moment.
I'd argue we could do with that anyway. So, I do think there's room here for a larger Australian defence industry base. But, I'm at heart a kind of economic rationalist, a liberal, a free market liberal who argues that Australia should be putting its resources enjoying the benefits of comparative advantage. If other countries do this better than us, let them do it, and let's do what we are good at.
You obviously grew up in Australia and are extremely Australian, but do you recognise that there is a very Dutch quality to that hyper-rationalist? Like, are you in touch with the Dutch roots?
A little bit, but not to that extent. I hadn't associated. Maybe what you're alluding to is a sort of unsentimental worldview that the Dutch have.
Yeah, realistic,
Yeah.
trade-off, unemotional.
Right.
Not to
Yes.
say it's without all of its charm as well, but
No,
at least for me,
I
that
recognise
feels
that.
very Dutch.
Yeah. No, I see that. Yeah.
Okay. Drones, we just mentioned the grenade on the DJI drone in Ukraine, but this seems like the antithesis to what you were saying earlier, where defense is cheaper than offense. If drone technology gets better, their range gets bigger, they're cheap to produce, does this then sort of flip the table immediately? And this is one of those unpredictable futures that we don't know whether it's going to happen or not?
Yeah, it's a good point. It's certainly a point when it comes to land warfare. So the use of drones to, target individual soldiers on a battlefield. I mean, unfortunately, we've all been subjected to those videos, from the Ukrainian battlefield of drones targeting individual Russian or Ukrainian soldiers in trenches. They're pretty awful. Now, first of all, there's already evidence that that balance is being equalised, that the means to hit drones is getting cheaper. So there's already a counterbalance working its way through that dynamic. Secondly, we come back to the range question that we talked about earlier. So that works when you are flying drones over a dozen kilometres or less. The distances involved in Australia make that far less relevant, and so flying a drone, several thousand kilometres to strike a target in Australia, it's a massively expensive and difficult exercise. And so the cost advantages there
they might
are
whittle
still
away
with the
back to
defensive
where we
side.
are already.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's an optimistic way to think about that. How surprised were you by how well your book foreshadowed the deteriorating global US reliance?
When I was writing the book, it was already on the cards that Trump was going to be the nominee again for a second time. But I think probably the more important point is that I don't think it matters very much that Trump was elected a second time. Trump doesn't so much affect the direction of movement in American policy. He only accelerates it.
Drastically so.
Well, not yet. Not in Asia just yet.
No?
I mean, he hasn't really done much Asia policy just yet. So he has on trade, but
But
not
in
so
the
much.
destruction of the soft power and the
for sure.
reputation.
That's true. That's very true. Yes, it's a good point. And in particular, that comes through in the way he treated that disastrous White House press conference with Zelensky, the way he's treated Canada, with European allies saying, well, we've got to do more independently. We've got to develop a European nuclear deterrent, for instance. So yes, you're absolutely right. He has accelerated questions about the doubts over the reliability of the United States in Australia, and I've seen it myself. Towards the end of last year, I had gone through a period of doing a lot of publicity and a lot of interviews like this and public events on the book. It dropped off towards the second half of last year, and after Trump got elected and some of those incidents took place, it's picked right back up again. Yeah.
What about specifically the Europe and the European Union? Surely Trump as a singular figure greatly accelerated their sort of shift towards maybe we got to take care of ourselves here rather than rely on the US.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's wait and see. I mean, there's a lot of promises been made. The Germans have now decoupled defence spending from their budgetary restrictions. We've yet to see exactly how that will be spent, what will be done. We've had the new German Chancellor talk about independence from the United States. We've had the French President talk about developing a European nuclear deterrent rather than just a French nuclear deterrent. I've got no doubts at all that the Europeans have the resources to do this. I mean, in crude economic terms, Europe collectively is 10 times larger than Russia. They have very mature and competitive defence industries. It's just a question of whether there's a political will there to actually arm themselves in the way that they should be. But in terms of the raw ingredients, they absolutely have the capacity to do this without the United States.
As someone swimming in these waters, how do you make sense of their inability to just get on with the job and be cohesive about it?
Well, ultimately, it's a political question. So, for as long as the Americans have been in charge of NATO, have led NATO, the question of European leadership was deferred. Now that we have a serious prospect of the United States pulling back from NATO, if not formally, then at least in a de facto sense, with Trump refusing to enforce
Just
Article
not honouring
5.
any agreements.
Yeah. Now the question of European leadership reemerges. So the old Kissinger question, right? Kissinger asked once during the 1970s, if I want to talk to Europe, who do I call? So he was essentially asking, well, who's the leader?
Right,
Who's in
right.
charge in Europe?
Yeah.
And if it's not America, then the old question about whether is it Berlin, is it Paris, is it London?
Brussels.
Is it Brussels? Right. So that question reemerges. And so the big constraint on Europe's ability to organise itself militarily is actually a political question. Can they solve this question of leadership without the Americans actually, permanently deferring or suppressing that leadership question? I still don't see a way out of that, actually. And the major problem there is that the EU lacks public authority in Europe. It lacks democratic legitimacy. So I think that's a very difficult problem that the Europeans face. In order to achieve the kind of political unity they need to definitively solve the problem you're alluding to about how they defend themselves without America, the EU needs to win a degree of authority and leadership that at the moment I don't think it's capable of summoning.
It might rely on Russia or some other aggressor attacking someone within the union themselves.
It may very well, yeah. But at that point, I wonder what happens to democratic legitimacy amongst the members of the European Union. I mean, already...
They splinter even further, maybe.
Well, what I'm alluding to is that, I think ultimately what Brexit was about was the United Kingdom, or enough voters within the United Kingdom, questioning the democratic legitimacy of the European project. Like, the sentiment of that animated Brexit was that we want to be in charge. We're not in charge anymore, and that sentiment's alive around Europe. So what happens when in a crisis you do have to politically unify to the degree that you're talking about, that you have to bring the European countries together to the extent that the EU, for instance, that you can build a European army, for instance. So, where's the democratic legitimacy in that? So who's going to vote for that? Which European power is going to vote for a European army?
Exactly. The ones closest to wherever the trouble is happening are
Perhaps.
all for it, but
Yeah.
what's Portugal got to do with
Right.
this? Yeah.
Yeah.
I suppose it is one of the enduring problems of whatever the complaints about the European Union might be.
Yeah,
But
I
it's
think
interesting
so.
with Sweden because they are so neutral, but they have such strong, in polling, positive sentiment towards the European Union. I think it's this incredible project, are thrilled to be a part of it, want to help as much as they can. Maybe because of their proximity with Russia, it's almost like a defense strategy in some sense. I don't know.
Yeah. Look, I find it very difficult to, short of a really major military emergency, such as an invasion that threatens, the leading powers in Europe, Germany, first and foremost. I find it difficult to see circumstances in which Europe can unify politically enough to create an institution such as a European army.
So I want to be respectful to the time you allotted. So let's get through as many of these as we
Okay.
can. Turning to Indonesia, I remember at school, I probably wouldn't have been able to point it to you on a map, even by the time I was 18. Such was the absence of this huge, extremely important 150 million people country to our north, or is it 300? But then, as you grow older and you start to look at your country where you're from through a different set of eyes, you start to realize, why do we not have all of these ties with Indonesia, whether it's economic or cultural? Like, there was an incredible statistic you gave in the Joe Walker interview about how few Indonesian immigrants we have in this country, despite them being our closest Asian neighbor. And so it's a lot of open questions for this distance that we have, despite geographically we're so close. So you've had to answer this question many times, so I want to try and offer a little bit of a different flavor to it. But assuming that the Echidna strategy was in place, what is the bull case for any further alliance with Indonesia?
Well, the bull case is that the Indonesians, against their current inclinations, are going to be forced by circumstances to look at Australia as a really useful resource for helping them achieve something that actually we both want, which is to ensure that China never becomes the dominant power in maritime Southeast Asia. I mean, I've argued subsequent to the book in an article that Australia should be aiming for a military alliance with Indonesia. I was about to say a formal military alliance. It would stop short of that because the Indonesians are very unlikely to ever form an actual treaty-level alliance with Australia, but it would have all the accoutrements of an alliance. And at the core of such an alliance, at the core of any real military alliance, is that you have shared strategic aims, and based upon those shared strategic aims, both sides have assurance that each would come to the aid of the other in a military emergency. And the shared aim that Australia and Indonesia have is that both countries would be materially far worse off if China was the dominant power in maritime Southeast Asia. And we can prevent that sort of future much better together than if we do it separately.
But isn't China more likely to, if they were to invade or attack anyone, attack Indonesia before Australia? And therefore our defensive first policy is almost immediately thrown out of the door?
Yeah, absolutely. But by the time of such a military confrontation with Indonesia, I think Australia would be, sufficiently alarmed by that I think our interests would be directly engaged as well. Yeah.
What about more broadly, just an explanation for why we don't have more cultural and economic ties to this country?
Well, the economic argument that's made that economists typically make is that there is insufficient compatibility between our two economies. There's no obvious way for Australia to plug into the Indonesian economy. We're both big resource exporters. So we don't marry up particularly well. The other problem is that there are lots of barriers on the Indonesian side. So one of those was resolved when we developed an FTA with Indonesia, but there's still massive behind the border problems there. Corruption, red tape, poor infrastructure in Indonesia. So it's been tried. Some of our big banks have gone into Indonesia and the rest of Southeast Asia.
So it's not
have
for
had
lack
some
of trying.
success. There's been some success, but China's a far easier market. Japan's a much easier market. New Zealand's a far easier market. For all the reasons that I said. The economic partnership's still fairly anemic. Culture, that's a little harder to explain. Again, it would be easier if there was a much bigger Indonesian diaspora in Australia. That in population terms, it's totally out of whack, right? So the number of Thais and the number of Vietnamese in Australia is way larger than Indonesians, even though the Indonesians have a far larger population. So I've argued, in fact, that Australia ought to develop a specific visa category to encourage a larger diaspora in Australia. I think that would offer really good ballast to the overall bilateral relationship if there was a much bigger Indonesian population here. Some people put that down to the fact that Indonesians are reluctant to emigrate. I don't think that's true. There's plenty of them in other parts of the world.
Look at the Netherlands.
Right, and in the Gulf, Persian Gulf as well, but also in Taiwan. So yeah, I don't think that passes the sniff test. It's more about the incentives.
Do you think it's non-trivial that they probably view us as really sloppy, oafish people because of what our main holiday destination being in Bali is? Like it's very intangible, but sometimes these sort of soft interactions people might have with the culture, even if it's just through the news, could be enough to really damage a reputation.
I mean, it wouldn't shock me if Balinese feel that way, but I would be surprised if the rest of Indonesia, if that had enough penetration into the rest of Indonesia to really matter.
It just strikes me as such a fascinating country. This giant archipelago, they had to go through this incredibly violent civil war to get some type of unification. They're set to be one of the biggest economies, one of the biggest populations within our lifetimes.
Yeah, I think. I've described the current intellectual environment in Australia vis-a-vis the China security threat as being something close to panic. We've really overstated the direct threat to Australia coming from China. If Indonesia was ever to be hostile to Australia, then all of that kind of near panic that I'm referring to, that would actually then be justified. Because Indonesia is so big that if it was ever both rich and hostile to Australia, we would instantly become one of the least secure countries in the world. Like we'd be something like South Korea or Poland, with a major power on our doorstep threatening us from just across a narrow archipelago. That would be extremely bad news for Australia. So there's a terrific amount of work to do to ensure that future never happens.
Predictions are futile, but where would you put your chips?
Especially the future.
Well, of course. Is that a line?
I think that's a Yogi Berra line.
Okay, there you go. But where would you put your chips on what the US-China-Oz relationship stands in 10 years?
In 10 years? I would put my chips on a continuation of the last 30 years, actually. So there is, of course, a risk of a severe disruption caused by a Trump-like figure where he says, we're jack of this, we're going home. Or on the Chinese side, it could be an invasion of Taiwan. But absent those kind of events, dramatic events, what we've seen over the last 30 years is the steady erosion of American willpower and American capability to affect the strategic balance in Asia. And so, the balance of probabilities to me is that we see that steady erosion continue, and that means slowly over time we will see, increasing indicators that America is that America is less reliable, and B, that China is the leading power and must be deferred to in various respects.
And if we stay course on our current defense policy, maybe with AUKUS being at the tip of that iceberg there, it's not us moving in the right direction, despite that inevitable continuation.
Well, in that future, then, first of all, by 2035, we will possibly just have gotten our second submarine from the United States. So think on that for a moment. When you consider
it does
how
make sense.
When you consider the way that this government and the previous government, how urgent they have said the security problem is, right? They routinely tell us this is the most challenging strategic environment since the Second World War. So why are we waiting this long? Why are we waiting until 2035? And even then, we'll only have 2 submarines, which is not a proper military capability, right? You need 3 in order to have a minimal capability.
Is that just bureaucracy and a lack of urgency in manufacturing that can explain why it takes 10, 15 years? Or are they just so bloody complex that there's so few people in the world who can do them?
It's the latter. They're absolutely incredibly complex.
Okay. Have you ever regretted leaving the intelligence service for a think tank and life of academia? Is there work you feel like you left behind?
No, I've never regretted that. I was glad of the experience, and I was very happy in that world. But the opportunity to be part of Australian public debate on defence policy is something that I treasure deeply, and the Lowy Institute has afforded me so many opportunities over the years that it would be impossible to regret that. I guess the one argument you could make about leaving government is that you lose access, particularly to I had a top secret security clearance, so you get to see pretty much everything. But to go back to an earlier point, it's less exciting than you think. I mean, there's Bob Carr had this great line in his memoir, Espionage Erotica. There's really titillating stuff out there that you learn about countries that they don't want you to know. But if your interest is in macro trends in world events, like what's the world going to look like in 20 years, what's Australia's place, classified intelligence will not help you, won't help you.
When you were working there, was there any consensus on who the best intelligence outfit was in the world?
No, not really. There was certainly no standout. And it was that was the question rarely arose. It was never a point of it was not a big cultural that didn't have a big cultural impact. What did have, I think, a too large a cultural impact was a culture of getting predictions right. So it takes you back to Tetlock. There was enormous pride taken in getting predictions right, and yet it would often stop at whether you got it right or not whether you got lucky or whether you use the right methodology.
Yeah. And people hedge their predictions just so they can get it right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, and also it didn't take into account the real world consequences of the judgment. Like, was the judgment acted upon? Okay, you got the call right, but did that actually change judgments? I mean, the stories are legion. Like Stalin's generals were telling him for months, the Germans are going to invade. And he said, no, we'll be fine. We've got this treaty with them. So, unless it's acted upon, it means almost nothing.
How deeply does Tetlock's research, and then more broadly, just the idea that how can we predict a future of infinite possibilities based off a finite experience of the past, really inform the way that you think and write about these topics? Since it's all subject to just being wrong almost immediately.
Yeah, well, the main thing is that it encourages modesty at all times. Everything is contingent. Everything has to be up for grabs. You may be wrong. The most, outrageous ideas need to be at least entertained, if only to dismiss them. It also makes you resistant to groupthink, and it encourages you almost to be a little bit lonely, because you can never. I mean, I feel most comfortable when I'm in the minority. As soon as too many people agree with me, I start thinking, oh, wait a minute, something may have gone wrong here. I don't. I mean, there are limits to that as well. So
the more people who interview about the Echidna strategy start to decide this was the wrong idea.
Well, I try not to turn that into a kind of fetish, because you can be a contrarian just for the sake of it, and I think that's dangerous too. The majority is the majority for a reason. But for me, the Iraq War in 2003 was such a formative event in my intellectual development. At the time, as a young analyst, I thought they were doing the right thing. I was never a full-blooded sort of neocon supporter of it, but I thought on balance this is the right thing to do. And that was a huge mistake on my part, and more importantly, a huge mistake on America's part. And one of the sort of signal lessons out of that for analysts is that the people who cheered that on, in America in particular, the people who were wrong about it, really didn't suffer any consequences. It's much safer to be wrong in the majority than to be right in the minority, right? So the people who said this is a terrible idea, we shouldn't do it, they were not in the decade or more that afterwards, they were not rewarded in career terms. It wasn't as if suddenly the media and the political class said, wow, these are the people we now need to listen to, let's promote them. That didn't happen. Instead, pretty much the status quo persisted, and the people that cheered on this conflict are still at the top of the tree in terms of commentary and analysis of international events in the United States. So, there's a little bit of risk involved in sort of maintaining your distance.
Were you more swayed by the WMD argument or like the Christopher Hitchens moralistic argument about bringing down Saddam?
I was probably more persuaded by the argument that, it was crudely referred to as the drain the swamp argument, that space needed to be created for Middle Eastern democracy to then develop.
So a moralistic argument.
I don't know if moralistic's quite the right word, but I mean, in retrospect, I'm glad I'm raising it again now, but I'm deeply ashamed of it, and it was totally contrary to my own training, my own sort of intellectual upbringing. I'm kind of a Burkean, you know. I grew up. My university, my thesis was about political conservatism, and this was the least conservative thing you could do. The idea that you could barge into a foreign country and try to rebuild its government and its society.
Impose a new philosophy.
Yeah, impose from the outside. I mean, it's totally contrary to everything Edmund Burke argued and Michael Oakeshott, another great influence on my thinking. So why I went along with that is a mystery to me, and I'm ashamed of it. Yeah.
Just two more, both quick ones. This I've asked every guest who's come on the show, some variation of the following. What was the role that serendipity has played in your life? And if we talk about a boy being born in the Netherlands, then moving to Australia, then going into intelligence, now writing a book, and all the serendipity that putting a book and your idea out into the world invites into your life. Broadly, how do you reflect on the role that serendipity has played?
I guess at the most basic level, it's being born in the time and place that you were, and then as a boy, as a 7-year-old, moving to another country that was equally wealthy and offered and egalitarian and free, and that offered the same kind of opportunities that the Netherlands did. I mean, that's pure chance right there, you know. And the comedian Louis C.K. has this bit about the time machine.
I don't know.
You know, and he uses it to make an argument about modern America, and he says, if you had a time machine that could take you back any time in history, where would you go? What would you do? And he makes a joke about race in America. You know, so if you're black in America, then any time before 1980, no thank you. You wouldn't go anywhere. But it's true across the board, right? It's true even for middle-aged white people like me. There has never been a better time to be alive, and there's never been a better place to be than Australia. Or the Netherlands, where I grew up. You know, two extremely rich, free, egalitarian countries. So that has afforded me opportunities that are pure chance.
Well then, Sam, absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time and answering all my questions.
My pleasure.